Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, welcome to the program.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing well.
Good.
This is we're going to have to, extend some birthday greetings today, with tongue in cheek, of course. The birthday to the day. 70 years since the world was saved by creating NATO. And everybody was pleased. Of course, I think they were looking for, some help after World War II to try to prevent it. So that was a disaster, of course, such a horrible mess. And Truman signed the bill on April 4th, 70 years ago. And the goal was, of course, to try to prevent war and all these noble things. But I've always found it fascinating that somebody did object to it, and that was the independent thinking of Robert Taft. And he said, and Robert Taft was not a non-interventionist because he says you should work for peace through diplomacy and peaceful effort. So theoretically, the description of the United Nations was much better than this military force of putting together. He said it would lead to trouble. I think one of the interesting predictions that he made, he says, if you do this and you have a NATO like this, why wouldn't it give the incentive to, what would happen if the Russians put their military, on our borders in Mexico? And of course, that is the logical conclusion, which means it wouldn't go smoothly. And that's been this argument all along with NATO. We do one thing, they do something else. We promise them we're not going to go up to your border, and then we do it anyway, and then it becomes competitive. And then there's a group of people, believe it or not, that doesn't want to have peace with Russia. I mean, it is in their interest to do it. I don't know, sometimes you wonder, it's so irrational, it doesn't make any sense. And some people think it's only to sell weapons, but it just doesn't make enough sense. But there are people that are determined, even when we were moving toward a better situation, after the Soviets collapsed, there was immediately people agitating, to try to antagonize and continue this Cold War. Right now, it looks like the Cold War people are doing okay, even though we would like to do something else with NATO, because NATO has not been our friend, is not our friend, provides no benefits, and I think Trump's on the right track. One comment or one quote from Trump in a meeting yesterday, he blurted out spontaneously by mistake. He said, "Why can't we be friends with Russia?" and he got condemned for it. People go, "What's he talking about?" So he wasn't being very diplomatic. But we're always hoping and praying that's his real instincts, and we think there is some of that in him, that he doesn't necessarily have a policy. I can't wait till we go to war with Russia. But of course, we could offer other advice if they're interested.
Well, there's a lot at stake in NATO. There are a lot of jobs. They just completed $1 billion new headquarters in Brussels. A lot of great jobs. Look at the military-industrial complex. In the U.S., we talk about how the Beltway is the richest part of the country, the area outside the Beltway, because the people there work for selling weapons to the Europeans. The Europeans buy weapons they don't really need to subsidize the U.S. Economy. And really, it's even if you could make the argument after World War II with the emergence of expansionary communism, as they claimed, and we needed a counter to the Warsaw Pact, which hadn't even been founded yet, that there needs to be some sort of a Western alliance. That is long gone. I mean, and that's why, and we'll talk about it later, but we sort of borrowed a title from our good friend Colonel Doug McGregor, who had a wonderful piece in the National Interest a few days ago about NATO being a zombie, and the imagery is perfect. Something that really is dead, but just doesn't know it's dead yet. And so,
well, my opinion is it's NATO's past retirement.
Get that social security.
before it keeps getting more zombie-like, But Stoltenberg, the Secretary General for NATO, sometimes they blurt out the truth or they let it leak out a little bit, because he was talking about it was necessary for us to spend more money to make the Russians spend more money, and that's how they would fight. But didn't we hear that during the Cold War? And even Reagan got more credit than he deserved. He brought the Soviets to its knees because we forced them to buy more weapons, which they probably did. They probably had to react, but we were still spending much more than they were. But it's acknowledged that we spend more money, they spend more money, and it's a tool. And nobody seems to have a great desire to say, maybe we could spend more money in our home countries if we didn't spend so much money trying to stir up trouble around the world.
And that really is the crux of this nice piece by McGregor, which goes through what happened after the end of the Cold War. And it's easy to forget. It's still relatively recent history. But he points out that Senator Lugar, back in '93, said NATO must go out of area or out of business, because the Soviet Union was gone. The Warsaw Pact was gone. So what were they going to do? What are they going to do? There was a lot of jobs. Well, then they decided to start going into the Balkans. The NATO got involved in the Balkan Wars between 1994 and 99, ending, of course, in the bombing of Yugoslavia. Then the Partnership for Peace in 1994 was announced. Hey, you former Warsaw Pact countries, you can join. You can be partners of ours. We'll give you goodies, and eventually you'll be buying our stuff. And then the expansion in 96 was announced. Weapon sales shot up. And then by 2001, another thing happened, terrorist threat. We got to keep NATO in the terrorist threat. And then now here we are back to where we are now from 2012, resurgent Russia.
And it was the policy of Clinton, to expand. In the 90s was expansion. And even before the bombing started in Yugoslavia, which was part of their deal, there was a concerted effort for some people, decent people, to slow up. Why do you have to expand? Why do you have to expand? And the George Kennan, a very well-respected diplomat, said that the expansion of NATO after World War II was the greatest mistake of the post-Cold War period. I mean, and that carried some weight, but nobody paid a lot of attention to him. Because I think he was right, because they hadn't even started. He was worrying about what it was going to do, just like Taft had worried. And it was a year or so later, then the bombing started in '99. And that does not have a very good humanitarian record, Killed a lot of innocent people and destroyed a lot of lives, and there was a lot of disruption from that bombing, and a lot of bombs were dropped.
Absolutely. I was living in Central Europe when Partnership for Peace was launched and the drive toward NATO expansion, and I saw firsthand the lavish spending by places like Lockheed Martin, lobbying these countries, lobbying the governments to get into NATO. And in fact, one of the articles, I think it may have been McGregor's or another, pointed out that Bruce Jackson, he was the top executive for Lockheed. At the same time, he founded the committee to expand NATO, made it look like it was a citizens committee, and he was raking in the money. They had, Dr. Paul, they had all kinds of junkets for journalists. I was working as a journalist at the time. Get on the bus, we're going to take you to the base, we're going to show you the stuff, have a huge lunch, all these wonderful things. It was amazing to watch NATO just slobbering at the mouth at the possibility of new members.
I think they look at it, and it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if they looked at it as a football game. They're just playing around, and we're making more money, and we're ripping people off. And they're not saying, well, we really want a hot war. We really want a hot war. They probably say, well, we won't need to, but they never consider, how many people died just because we are a little bit more cautious about American soldiers. I mean, how many people died in the Middle East and Syria and all these other places. So it's something that they play this game back and forth. But one other thing that struck me about the speech yesterday, Stoltenberg, he gave, it's unusual for somebody like this to come to, a joint session, House and Senate. He was invited by McConnell and Pelosi. That sounds like it was very bipartisan.
Collusion.
Here they are fighting tooth and nail like they kill each other on who to blame for hating Russia or not hating Russia, and yet they can get together and they bring together and they come together, and welcome this individual. I have to say though, there was if you were looking at the applause lines, he had a greater reception with the Democrats, which but it was still that's secondary to the fact of what's the leadership doing. What do they want? It's the leadership of the Republican, leadership of the Democrat. They get together and to make this imprint that, yes, it's NATO. NATO is important. This is national defense. If you don't support us, not only are you opposed to this bipartisan agreement, you're unpatriotic and you're against our military. What's our military going to do? We have all these weapons. We have to use them once in a while, the Hillary argument.
Yeah, Jens Stoltenberg is a huge hawk in NATO, as they all are. But, the NATO Secretary Generalship really is just a jobs program for failed European former leaders. And that's exactly what Stoltenberg is and his predecessors were. It gives them a feeling of being important. But, there's another piece, and we caught it on antiwar.com yesterday, I think it was, by Gilbert Doctorow, which is a really fascinating piece that points out that in reality the Europeans and indeed the entire NATO alliance is just a fifth wheel militarily for the U.S. And it's a great point. He says it's a toolkit to be used to pick up additional competences in variable geography alliances to confront challenges the U.S. defines unilaterally and without consultation. The Europeans just go along there, and he makes the point from the technology gap between what the Europeans do defensively. We know they don't spend any money on defense. What their capabilities are technologically on defense and weaponry is so far removed from that of the U.S. that it's completely irrelevant. There is no real alliance of partners. It's the U.S. and these countries we drag along when we need to give window dressing.
And a lot of special things are added on, and then you get a person like Pence, who plays along with this because he likes to be the very diplomatic vice president and go and negotiate. But I tell you what, Pence is not George Cannon, and he's not a non-interventionist. Because just this week, the first thing he did, he threatened the Russians about the sea lanes in the Black Sea.
Yeah.
The argument of sea lanes and where they come between Ukraine and the Russians, which is probably a realistic problem. But for our vice president to go over there and lay down the law and say, you guys, no, not you guys, because we have our friend running Ukraine now. It's you, Russia, you're causing the trouble. And of course, my position would be to, let them sort that out. But if we didn't have a NATO, he was more or less speaking for NATO, because they were very much involved in, the changeover in Ukraine. But he also went over there, and he really was very, very unhappy with Turkey. Turkey. We had a plan, I guess, maybe a contract or an agreement that we were going to sell them some F-35s or something. And because I'm not positive of all this, but it probably had something to do with, the squabble with the Kurds, and therefore they were backing off and annoyed us. So we canceled that order. And they're not going to get the F-35. So they say, well, we have to protect ourselves. So the Turks had the audacity to go next door in the shop and buy stuff from Russia. So Pence is over there. If you do that, you are going to be in big trouble, because that is not permissible. You're either with us or you're against us, and it looks like you're going to be with the terrorists. And I think that is so. I mean, even with a vice president, I don't like the imperial president, but certainly we don't need two of them.
Yeah.
And Pence. Of course, we've had that, though. When you look back at the Bush administration, we had an imperialistic vice president, too.
I don't know if we have the tweet that Pence put out that started this whole brouhaha, but if we do, it shows the kind of diplomacy Turkey must choose. Does it want to remain a critical partner in the most successful military alliance in history, or does it want to risk the security of that partnership by making such reckless decisions that undermine NATO? And before that, he said, we won't stand idly by while NATO allies purchase weapons from our adversaries. It
sounds like this will precipitate decision making, which they've already made. But I don't think it's like Turkey doesn't have a decision. They've made a decision, and this has happened economically in other areas where we keep putting on sanctions and controls, and the Europeans, want to trade with Iran and this sort of thing. It's always these threats. So I think the threats and the innuendos and the sanctions and all, I think they're less effective. I think our clout is not quite what it used to be, and I don't think Pence is capable of restoring the ruthlessness, even though I'm sure everybody in the administration would like to. Except I'm still hoping the president has a soft spot in his heart for peace.
Well, that is a great point, though, because they're no longer feared or even respected. When Pence said all this stuff, Erdogan in Turkey, who's not going to be pushed around, he said, hey, you're either with us or the terrorists. And the point is that the U.S. got involved, and of course this can all be traced back to interventionism. The U.S. got involved to overthrow the Syrian government. They coaxed the Turks on board. They came on board. The U.S. didn't have anyone to fight. They were arming al-Qaeda. They were arming ISIS. And when people blew the whistle on that, it became embarrassing. So they said, we got to start arming the Kurds because they're the only people left that can fight for us to overthrow Assad. Well, obviously Erdogan wasn't too thrilled about that, and feeling insecure, that forced him into an alliance, a de facto alliance with Russia. So we forced this relationship to happen, and then we scream, how dare you have this relationship? Don't buy those S-400s, or we're not going to sell you our planes. And he said, go take a hike. I don't care.
I think it's time now to declare a interest in the Monroe Doctrine. And we can modify it a little bit, but we've not followed the rules on the Monroe Doctrine, even though it's not a rule and it's not a law or anything else. But the Monroe Doctrine implied that we would not get involved in the internal affairs of Europe. So would this be a good time? Well, we sort of want to go back toward a tradition of the Monroe Doctrine, and we're just coming home. You take care of yourself. But I don't think that's going to happen. I guess it's interesting to postulate just what would happen to Europe, if NATO just closed down, closed shop. There'd be a few jobs at the headquarters there that would be lost. But I obviously think should have never started. And we shouldn't have it now, and Trump's instincts are right when we should get out or defund it, and we shouldn't just be satisfied because, they listen to our threats, they're going to put more money in. But they haven't even done that yet. That just go on and on. So I think when you have the empire, you're under the gun, because if you don't follow through with your threats, you might lose your empire. Yeah. And that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And that is, its economics are just as important as what kind of a military might that we have, because the Soviet system collapsed, because of financial reasons, if for no other reason. But it wasn't because we forced them to buy more weapons. They had a bad system. We have a fragile economic system, and we also spend too much money on militarism, and we get too much involved in all this militarism and kowtow to the military-industrial complex. That's a big one.
Yeah. Well, I'll close with you just with a thought from our good friend Pat Buchanan, who's usually right on the mark on all these things. He had a piece in the American Conservative. He makes a good point. He was basically saying, no more expansion. This is ridiculous, because they're talking about Georgia. They're talking. Pompeo said yesterday, North Macedonia is now going to join. Who could even find it? Yeah, they're going to save us. But he said no new expansion. He made the great point. None of the countries that NATO has expanded into membership in the last 20 years was considered worthy of a war with Russia through the entire Cold War. They were just not of vital interest. How about Hungary 56, Prague Spring, Solidarity? None of this was worth a war. So now why all of a sudden, after the Cold War, is it worth a war? It's insane. Final thought is a reminder again, we are through the month of April raising a little bit of money for the show, for the Ron Paul Institute. You can only get this book by making your donation to the Ron Paul Institute. Join us as a member at $50. And we'll give you a book. Join us as a super member at 100 or more, and Dr. Paul will sign the book. Our way of saying thank you. This is a terrific book, and you're going to really enjoy it. Dr. Paul?
Very good. And I'll close with a statement about this particular date, 70-year anniversary from the time that Truman and the United States signed into NATO. We don't need NATO. We should get rid of NATO, and the sooner the better. But it also makes a very important point that it's dangerous having organizations like this. It didn't help us. It sort of is a way for us to make an excuse because we've hid behind NATO at times when you go into Libya and Afghanistan and all these places. So in a way, I see NATO as a moral hazard. And it's a moral hazard not only for us, we get engaged when we shouldn't be engaged, but what about if we did leave Europe? Europeans would have to think about their national defense. Maybe they would want to be real nice to their neighbors and get along because they're anxious to do it. They want to trade with Iran, and that means they would become friendlier with Russia. So, but because we take care of them and we put pressure on them and we provide everything, we provide jobs for them, big bases, and all of these things, they do that because we back them up. So we are a moral hazard to the Europeans, and they believe that we will do anything and everything to take care of them under all circumstances. We bailed them out as we bailed out so many in the last economic downturn. But there's a limit to all this, economic limits and military limits. So that's what people ought to know about and be prepared for. But I think it's not likely that we're going to have a new Congress next year, and we're going to have people in there voting. We're going to downsize or get rid of NATO. No, that's not going to happen. But that whole alliance will break up. It's already been indicated that they're losing their clout anyway. So we ought to think about it. But most of the things that people avoid, whether it's in a monetary policy, economic policy, or foreign policy, are the unintended consequences, the moral hazard of people thinking, well, they'll take care of us, so we'll do this. So that is why that whole argument goes all the way back to the individual. If an individual knows that there's always a safety net, somebody is always there and there will be compelled by law to take care of whatever I need. So insurances, government insurance, build your houses in flood-prone area and the government will take care of. Put money in a bank and goes broke, the government will take care of. So there are these unintended consequences, and the moral hazard is caused. If we just got rid of that, believe me, the world would be a lot better off, it would be a lot wealthier, and it would be a lot more peaceful. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.